So the next speaker, Nancy Sonti, is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station based out of Baltimore, Maryland Field Station, where she works as an interdisciplinary research studying urban socio-ecological systems and works to build collaboration between academics, community groups, and government agencies. Please welcome Nancy Sonti.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here in this wonderful room of urban foresters. I'm really excited to get to talk to you guys today and about this topic of urban tree selection and urban tree supply, which I think is, just becoming a bigger and bigger topic as we have all of these tree planting initiatives happening, great grant funding opportunities and programs rolling out. There's a question about, well, what trees are we going to plant? Can we diversify the palette? Where are we going to get them? What does that supply chain look like? And I'm really grateful to Leslie's talk. There's just so many great tie-ins there, introducing this idea of, the who, what, where, when, and how of urban forestry, because I'm also going to kind of dig into that a little bit. Who is making these decisions? What are they deciding to plant and where? How are they making those decisions? Why? And so I don't have videos, but I do have some hopefully interesting and juicy quotes from people along that supply chain. I also talked to a lot of urban foresters and folks from different sectors in our multiverse, as she said. So first, I'll just back up a little bit and talk about where I sit in the U.S. Forest Service, just because folks don't always know about our research branch. So within the U.S. Forest Service, we're in the Department of Agriculture, and of course we have our national forest system, but we also have state, private, and tribal forestry, providing assistance and funding opportunities, technical assistance, and then we have research and development where I am. And within research, we have this network of urban field stations, and so of course, for you guys, it's obvious why we would need research on urban forestry and urban ecology, but within the U.S. Forest Service, it took a long time to kind of gain that momentum, right? To move out of the wildland into the city and provide our research attention and expertise to urban areas and to think about the social ecological dynamics happening in cities. And so you can see maybe on this map, I don't know how easy it is to see our different locations. We're spread across the country, but of course we have a cluster in our highly urbanized Northeast corridor. And although I'm based in Baltimore, I do work in Washington, D.C., and throughout the region through efforts like the Chesapeake Bay Program Forestry Work Group. So we like to say that we're place-based but not place-bound. And so ideally, we're doing research, we're co-producing research with practitioners, policymakers, students, and even community members that can be based in a particular location, but can be scaled up or transferred and applied in other locations across the country. And I think that this question of urban tree supply is a great example of that, because it's a highly applied question where we're really trying to answer questions that urban foresters have at this moment and that will help them, advance the cause of creating greener cities, more livable cities with a better quality of life for urban residents and a healthier environment. So I'm gonna kind of touch on 3 different projects or initiatives on this topic. I'll spend the most time on the first one, Selection in the City, which is a case study based in Baltimore City, where we did this nursery supply chain analysis. But then I'm also gonna mention a broader Chesapeake Bay region effort that was similar, that's wrapping up right now, and then talk about a national initiative that the U.S. Forest Service has as well. So starting local, thinking about Baltimore City, we wanted to dive into this topic of domestic selection. I think I'm gonna follow in others' footsteps and maybe walk around a little bit so I can see what I'm doing here. So what is domestic selection? So this is a concept that my colleague Megan Evolio at Johns Hopkins University has been writing about. And if we think back to kind of high school biology class, we had artificial selection and natural selection, right? And so natural selection is happening in the background, out in the natural world, and then artificial selection is when we select different traits. We're breeding for different traits. But domestic selection, it includes that and broadens it out further to think about decisions that are made about which trees to breed, which species, to develop cultivars for, which ones to propagate, to sell, and then which ones are selected and designed into plans and ultimately planted out in the landscape and maybe allowed to persist on the landscape, right? Versus being removed or managed in different ways and involve landowner decisions and land manager decisions. This is a diagram from one of Megan Evolio's papers that kind of lays out these different processes. And traditionally, again, in traditional biology, we might think about a regional species pool, so the species that can live in our region, our climate, the conditions that we have here, which include, competition from coexisting species. But now, of course, we have a global species pool because we can move them all around the world. So we've really broadened that out quite a bit. And there's different filters then that large species pool goes through to result in our local urban community here meaning plant community or tree community in our case. And there's different decisions that are made along the way that involve both human behavior and also natural processes that are happening. Here's another similar diagram. This is from a paper by Dr. Deb Hilbert. And this one I like because it really gets more specific to urban forestry, right, to our discipline, and thinks in detail about this is kind of a similar concept, starting with that large regional global species pool and then drilling down to the bottom where we have what she says a limited pool of tree taxa for local urban use, because of course we do end up seeing a much smaller suite of species that are actually planted and survive in the landscape. But in order to get there, there's a lot of processes happening. We have a lot of actors and decision makers along the way making decisions about, again, what to select, what to breed, what is commercially viable to grow in the nursery, and then policies around what goals we might have for planting plans and designs, preferences, and then when it comes down to it on the planting day, what's available, what actually ends up in the ground. So for this Selection in the City project, we wanted to kind of unpack this. This is from kind of a theoretical conceptual paper, and we wanted to apply it in Baltimore City and try to follow those decisions and that supply chain all the way out to understand how and why people are making decisions about which trees to select and plant. So we called it a supply chain analysis, and we used a snowball sampling approach where we started with tree planting organizations and urban forestry groups and then found out who they were working with on the ground and where they were sourcing their trees, and then went back from there all the way to the growers producing material. And so we had a really basic question or basic goal here to understand their motivations behind choosing certain species or cultivars. This is the research team for this project. The overall project, which I'll briefly describe, is led by Megan Evolio. Karen Burkhart is part of the team at University of Maryland, myself, and my colleague Dexter Locke. And so Dexter and I led this component, this supply chain analysis. And I also want to thank our student, Eva Perry, who did some of the interviews as well. So our supply chain analysis is part of a larger grant-funded project funded by USDA, NIFA program. And so we also have an interest in understanding how that selection is playing out biologically on the landscape. And we have students who have been sampling focal maple species. We picked a couple maple species to kind of test this out, looking at the actual genetic diversity of those maples. So do we see genetic material from the cultivars mixing with the native, the wild type populations? How does that play out across different site types? And then what are the implications for tree performance, for growth and physiology, and also for the insect communities that are associated with those trees? So I don't have results for those parts yet, but stay tuned, and we have some really interesting results developing there. But today I'm focused on this objective of the overall project, looking at these actors in the supply chain. And so just to give a little more detail about our methods and the folks that we talked to, as I said, we started with the urban forestry practitioners. So these are groups that are doing direct planting on the landscape. They are setting policy, creating approved tree lists or prohibited trees, maybe engaging in tree giveaways, right? So influencing what gets planted on private residential properties. I should mention that is one group, that's not part of the study. We didn't talk to individual residents and homeowners about their preferences. There's other work, other studies that have looked at this, and so we kind of wanted to see more from that programmatic level, how these decisions get made and how that trickles up the supply chain. But I will say that, you do kind of hear their voices come through, as you might imagine, at different points. We interviewed landscape architects and contractors. We didn't initially have them as such a major component of our study, but after talking to the urban foresters, we realized how important, of course, contractors can be in the process and how influential landscape architects are as well. And then from there, we went to the regional nurseries who are supplying trees to these projects in the city. And so I kind of make a distinction here between the regional nurseries who are directly supplying the trees, and then the growers. Those are ones often sending that material to the regional nurseries, right? Because the regional nurseries are getting liners and whips and material from elsewhere, growing them up, and then supplying them to the city. And those growers are often breeding as well, so they're also making decisions back at that level about developing new cultivars. So in total, we had 36 interviews for this study, and these are kind of the basic questions. I'm going to go through and unpack some of the interesting answers that we heard. But how do you decide which species or cultivars to breed, grow, sell, or plant, depending on where they are in the supply chain? And then because we have a particular interest in diversity and genetic diversity, we also asked about that. Now, we first left the question open-ended, so some people did mention diversity right off the bat, but if they didn't, we probed a little further to understand more about that. And I realized this morning that I don't actually have a slide up here that just states why we should care about diversity in our tree population. And, it's kind of been, Leslie mentioned some factors this morning, and I think it could be a topic that's familiar, but it's something that, we want to think about, not just issues of biodiversity and insect diversity, supporting animals. That is, certainly important to make our cities vibrant and sustainable, but also to make our tree populations resilient, right? If we have low diversity and a pest or pathogen comes through and wipes everything out, then that street or that block suddenly has no canopy. Whereas if we have a greater mix going on, we might be more resilient to not just pests and pathogens, but drought or other environmental conditions. And that can be true at the genetic level as well, right? A more genetically diverse population may be able to withstand different stresses and pressures into the future than a completely homogeneous population. So I'll just go through some of our key themes and kind of share some of the voices of the interviewees. Planting site conditions, so maybe not surprisingly, this was one of the major themes that came up from the urban foresters and the landscape architects. This is pretty much the first thing that people mention, is matching the tree to the site conditions, making sure that it's the right tree for that location, and sort of acknowledging that in some more favorable sites, you might be able to choose from a larger suite of species, but then when it comes to, let's say, a street tree pit, there's a more narrow range of species to choose from that they think will actually do well in that site. They also mentioned looking at what else is growing around the site, or with street trees, what else is there on the block, which I think is interesting because it kind of shows this interplay between diversity and survival and the site conditions, right? Where if you're always looking to plant what you see nearby, you're not necessarily going to be increasing diversity, even though the intention may be to just make sure that the tree survives because you see that species doing well there already. And then we also heard discussions about, restoration sites being different from the more landscaped sites, and sometimes straight species, so, grown from seed, not the cultivars, that those are just pigeonholed into these restoration sites. And otherwise, cultivars are generally selected for some of the harsher urban environments. Landscape architects came up quite often, as being mentioned by the other folks we interviewed, the other sectors. So thinking about aesthetics and design, we heard from the nurseries a lot, well, the landscape architects are dictating, what the design is. They're the ones making these decisions, and they're trying to create patterns or uniformity sometimes. I like this quote, I think. So this is from a nursery who clearly does prioritize diversity. That's biological diversity is really top of mind for them. So he's describing that people come in and they want these identical rows of trees, and I suggest to them, well, maybe you just alternate like a couple species, and that could look okay too. Sometimes they take me up on that, and usually they don't. So there's definitely some frustration, I guess, between the sectors that emerged throughout these interviews, and some misunderstanding that was kind of a theme throughout that I think just points to the need for all of these folks to get together at, venues like this is a perfect example of understanding each step in this chain of decisions. But, we certainly can't ignore aesthetics. Like, we can have our plans and our talks about climate resilience and pest resilience and shade, canopy cover, and that's great, but ultimately people want to see fall color and they want to see flowers. And as we've heard, like, forcing things on people and not listening to their preferences and desires is generally not going to go well, right? So we certainly have to acknowledge this as an important factor. Familiarity. So this was really a prominent theme, this idea that people tend to plant what they've planted before. They tend to design what they've designed before to include the same species. That name recognition is important and becoming more important. So we heard that from the nurseries, that this branding of species and cultivars is gaining more and more importance, which, I guess it makes sense, right? Like any commercial product, there's brand and name recognition. And so I like this quote that you could have the best holly, the absolute best holly that's ever existed, but if they don't know that name, you can't really sell it. So even though we like to think that we're basing decisions on science, the best available science and evidence, and developing new product, it won't necessarily work, right? People kind of go back to what they're familiar with. Landscape architects, they themselves mentioned using old faithfuls, right? Like, I know what works. I've been doing this for decades. So I guess there's a lot of inertia, right, around not moving to what's unfamiliar, what might be new and different. Availability. So this, of course, is really important. I mean, you can't source the tree and plant it if it's not available. And I know Leslie mentioned that, like, where's the secret, the magic key to the unlimited tree supply? And we heard that there's this disconnect, right, between what's being requested, what's included in designs, and what's actually available in the market, that people have like this pie in the sky wish list, and the nurseries are like, sorry, that's just not realistic. So that kind of points to a need to maybe think differently, think about different strategies, because it might be difficult, or it might take a long time to get some of these nurseries to move in a different direction. And that's particularly true for seed-grown trees, some native, more unusual native species. And we heard that seed collection is like a dying art. It's kind of a part-time job, like a hobby job that folks have, often older folks, and it's just not a skill maybe that people are developing or passing on, and so it's harder and harder to find seed, to source seed. So that was really interesting. And then hearing from the city agency, approving plans, that they're just seeing more and more requests to substitute species or sizes when the time comes. So you might have the best intentions for a plan, but that's not what actually ends up getting planted. Now, the flip side, of course, we have supply and we have demand, and the two influence each other. And so this quote from the grower is really just like typical of what most of them said. Whatever the customers are asking for, that's what we seek to supply. Like, we look at our previous sales, and we base that, we want to sell trees. Like, that's the most important thing. But again, it's often based on what has sold in the past. And even though there's some recognition that there's new trends, that they want to try to meet demand for those new trends, they're going to play it safe, right? Like, it's a big gamble. This is mentioned a lot. It's a really risky industry because it takes several years to grow the stock, and no one can predict exactly what's going to be in demand a few years from now. And so I remember one person said, it's like if you have a grocery store, you have to sell milk and bread. You can't just be selling like the shiny new cultivar. You have to keep stocking what has sold well in the past. And then policy and regulation. So this came up, and this could be, formal laws, but it could be more informal policy or sustainability goals as well, right? In general, this is something that is mentioned by the urban foresters as, they're trying to meet these targets. They want to increase natives. There's prohibited invasives, or trees that are really known to be susceptible to pests and disease are taken off the accepted tree planting lists. You might have different lists available for different site types. So again, in these restoration areas versus the more landscaped areas, you might see different tree lists. But then we also heard, some pushback on that, right, from nurseries and growers. There's sometimes a frustration, like, okay, they say they want native trees, but there's nothing native about that street tree pit. And also, by the way, what does native mean? Native to what? Native to where? And part of that is like, there can be a geographic disconnect, right, where you have growers many states over developing material that ends up over here. They're not necessarily part of the local conversation. So having that chain of communication open, I think, could be really important. And maybe in the urban forestry community, acknowledging that, like, these are sometimes complex questions. It's not always straightforward what native means and what our goals are. Questions about whether a native cultivar counts as a native species, or a native tree, for that to meet those requirements. That came up quite a bit. And sometimes these initiatives or pushes for diversity or natives are not quantified, right? It's like a target, but it's more of a general qualitative target, so that could be really difficult to enforce, and it could be difficult to kind of see the chain of where these natives or where the seed source is coming from. We also heard about tree canopy cover goals. So, for example, landscape architects in their plan for an individual site trying to meet the canopy cover goal for this that the city has, right? Or just sometimes in a more general sense, just selecting the largest tree possible that they could get in there, the species that's going to have the largest stature, just to try to increase shade and canopy in their own way. So production constraints, this came up, along the lines of talking about some of these native species and expanding to different native species, is that, ultimately these nurseries and growers have to generate a profit, right? And so sometimes new species can be difficult to incorporate into the mix, especially if they have too much variation in size and quality of individuals. So that could be, with seed-grown trees, requires too many touches, so the labor cost is too high, or just takes too long. And I'll kind of get back to this, but I think, we've already heard about Montgomery County having their nursery. I know Casey Trees has a nursery, right? So again, thinking sometimes outside of the traditional commercial production chain might be necessary to meet some needs that we have. So now kind of delving into this idea of diversity, when we did press them on whether they consider diversity, I'd say, the urban foresters, the tree planting groups, they certainly mentioned diversity off the bat, right? That this is a goal to increase diversity, not to have too much of any particular species. I also heard it from quite a few landscape architects, although certainly not all, and I think it depended on the context, right, for them. Sometimes you want something that looks a certain way or more uniform, and sometimes you're trying to diversify a site. Growers and nurseries, there was a few that really, for them, this was really important, like almost part of their mission to increase the availability, or the diversity of offerings. But it was really a minority, right? And for others, that wasn't really like a driving factor or consideration for them. It was just like, well, whatever the customers want, that's what we're gonna supply. Again, even when it is an important consideration, it's not necessarily quantified. And this actually makes me want to bring up the point about inventories and about having data, because you can't really have a target and enforce it and quantify it unless you know what's out in the landscape. I mean, at least if you're thinking about your overall population, your street tree population, trees in the parks, residential trees for giveaways. So I think understanding about your baseline and where you're at and what kind of diversity you'd like to see, but also constraints to that, of course, like maybe some sites are better places to increase diversity than others. And this idea, again, from the nurseries, that it's hard to incorporate new trees depending on their growing requirements, but diversity really does minimize risk, and that's true across the sectors. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, why is diversity important? Well, as the landscape architect says, monocultures can be a liability. You planted all of this one thing, and then that batch happened to not be great from that particular shipment, or you had a year with too much rain, or too dry, or a new pest came through that you weren't expecting, and suddenly that site is terrible. And then the same for the nurseries. It's like an investment portfolio, so you want to diversify to hedge against risk. So I think this concept is there, and it could kind of be developed to think a little bit more biologically, environmentally, about how we create healthier and more resilient tree populations. Genetic diversity, so on the other hand, of course, this is an interest in our research team, and we're studying it on the landscape. So we were curious, does anyone ever really think about this? And again, there was like a minority of a couple nurseries, primarily native plant nurseries, they're absolutely were thinking about it. We're growing from seed. That's kind of our whole mission. This is why we're here, is to increase genetic diversity of these species on the landscape. But then when you get to the larger, most of the commercial nurseries, they're actually avoiding genetic diversity, right? They're like, cultivars were developed for a reason. They're better trees. So why does anyone want a straight species? We really heard a lot of that, just kind of frustration. Or we sell a few of those, and we always have to figure out how to source them, but we mainly are sticking to cultivars whenever possible. When there is interest in genetic diversity and kind of sourcing different genetic populations within a species, it can be really hard to do that. So you might have a desire to source a more southern population for climate adaptation, but to actually understand like where those trees came from, when there's so many different touches, so many different places they went through along the way to get to that point of the tree giveaway, it can be really difficult to enforce it without, I think, like a whole initiative and staff support and effort to do just that. So I guess overall for this study, I'll just kind of share what I think are some of our key findings so far before I jump into the other related studies that we're doing. But aesthetics and familiarity are really important. They're driving a lot of decisions, and we certainly can't ignore the importance of those factors. There's a need for perhaps more data about the diversity in our tree populations so that we can have more specific goals. If it's something that we really want to enforce, if it's not going to just be like a hope and a wish. And that there's kind of some logistical challenges within the nurseries to expanding the palette, especially thinking about seed-grown trees. And so we might need to think about different ways to get around that. I think having more discussions about what native really means and why it's important for different situations could help with our sort of understanding across sectors. Because there is this feeling that a push for native might be at odds with survival, right? And I don't think that's necessarily what anyone wants. So I'll kind of return to this theme about the need for more communication. And I will say it was also interesting to hear, since we're here in Maryland, the Tree Solutions Now Act, the 5 Million Trees Initiative. This did come up, but not maybe as frequently as I would have thought. It certainly came up with the urban foresters, but that the nurseries, only a few really were aware of it and didn't necessarily seem to think it was going to be driving their decisions. Now, I'm sure it takes time for initiatives like that, right, to kind of percolate through and for everyone to be aware of what's going on. But I'll talk more about this in sort of our regional study, that even though we have these public policy goals and projects, it can be hard for that to sort of break through with just commercial development being such a great demand for trees from these nurseries. So now I'll kind of broaden out to this study, addressing regional tree supply challenges and opportunities. This is a Chesapeake Bay region-wide project that was led by Deb Hilbert and the rest of our research team. And so while the first study I talked about was really quite open-ended, sort of academic, thinking about like, what is this process of domestic selection and how are people making decisions? What's motivating them? This was a bit more targeted. This was really saying like, we have an issue with tree supply, with diversity and quality of trees, and so what are the challenges preventing us from getting what we need, and what are the solutions that might get us there? What are the opportunities? So this was funded by the EPA as part of the Chesapeake Bay programs, one of their goal implementation teams, where the goal is increasing urban tree canopy. We just had a big virtual tree supply forum in August. Hopefully some folks were able to join. And so I just wanted to present some highlights from some of what we shared there based on our focus group study. The forum was a great way to kind of bring people together across this large geography where getting together in person can be challenging. And we had great speakers, including Washington, D.C.'s Urban Forestry Division, Casey Trees, representing and talking about working together, which is really wonderful. But the goal here like I said, to identify the constraints that limit availability, diversity, quality of nursery trees for urban tree plantings, and then identify opportunities to create a more sustainable and equitable supply of urban trees. So for this, instead of individual interviews, this study included 3 focus groups led by Deb Hilbert, and I want to thank her for providing the material for some of these slides. And again, looking across sectors, but this time kind of mixing people together in the same focus group from across sectors so they could kind of bounce ideas off of each other and share what their challenges were. And this was spread from across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed region. So it's a lot of ground to cover, but I will say that in this work in social science, we do tend to find what we call saturation, right? So whether it's 16 people or 60 people, sometimes you just start to hear the same themes over and over again, and then you kind of know that you've hit on all the main perspectives and opinions. So just briefly, when we asked about the factors that are influencing production and purchasing of trees, we found themes that were really similar to what I shared for Baltimore City, so I won't get too much into it, but of course, demand, availability, the influence of these large-scale purchasers like developers, that can really dominate for the nurseries what they're going to be supplying. We did hear that climate change considerations were important for them, so thinking about climate adaptation in their tree selection. But then I want to kind of spend more time here on the specific challenges that were articulated. So in thinking about availability, again, there was a mention of specific natives that are not cultivars, and seed being really difficult to source throughout the region, not finding the liners that they want, or that the growers were sort of dictating availability, and maybe they were too far removed from the people who were designing and planting the trees. The timing, that can be difficult, right? We have a lot of grant-funded projects on a shorter time scale that doesn't allow for actually planning with producers for that tree supply of the suite of species that you might desire. And again, that these small municipal purchases don't influence the market the way the large private development projects do. So perhaps, increasing staffing and support to kind of make those connections and plan for projects out, and changing policy and funding timelines could be something to work through. And of course, environment, biology, difficult planting conditions, this is always a challenge and a constraint. And what are some of the opportunities? So communication, this is a big one, and partnership. I mean, this kind of just is an overarching theme, I think, and a takeaway is just spending time together, at events like this is one opportunity where you can really talk to people across sectors and understand their perspective. I really felt in listening to these interviews that landscape architects were just hugely important, and there was such a diversity of perspectives among landscape architects, right? From those that were native species and diversity were top of mind, to others where it wasn't much of a consideration at all. And these are all landscape architects named by Baltimore City as being really influential in designing projects, large projects going into the city. So just making sure that we're not in our bubble of just sort of municipal foresters, but talking to the private sector, talking to the nurseries, visiting the tree farm. I know Casey Trees is always happy to do a tour of their tree farm, but it's really important to understand what goes into growing these trees and supplying them. And again, that might be a way to think about alternative production methods. There's a lot fewer municipal nurseries and state nurseries than there used to be, and those could be a way to really just be more forward-thinking and creative, and maybe be able to take risks in a way that the private nurseries can't. And so that's something that I've heard a lot of talk about, bringing those back, or even nonprofit nurseries. There can be a great tie-in there with workforce training and development there's just this mismatch. Like, we need a robust urban tree supply, and we don't have it. We also have young people looking for careers in urban forestry and all facets of urban forestry. And so I think that perhaps nursery work and developing this urban tree supply is a possible place to explore there. Developing sort of avenues for technical assistance and just sharing information so that you're not kind of in a bubble, which can be really difficult, especially when you're a department of one, as Leslie said, but to kind of be able to pick your head up so that you have reinforcement and advice when you're trying to make these arguments about why diversity is important, why resilience in our tree population is important. Contract growing up at the top of the list. So this is often brought up as, this like magical solution that if we could just have contract growing, and here's a couple of examples of how it works out so well. But then you hear from a lot of folks in these focus groups like, that's great, but like in practice, it just doesn't work. It's too difficult. Like, the nurseries don't feel secure. And then the municipalities, they just don't have the funding guaranteed for long enough, right? It's hard for them to plan that far out. And so I think it's not something to give up on, but I do think it's like to recognize that there's challenges there. It can work amazingly well when it does work, but it can be difficult to implement, and there might be ways to get our policymakers and funders to change their requirements and their specs, maybe change their timelines to allow for this so that you actually are getting the variety of species grown the way you want from these producers, and then the producers feel secure that they have a contract and they feel financially secure, right? That it's not too much of a risk for them. And increasing staffing, I mean, that's another policy point, right? Is that there's just, in all facets of urban forestry, it always feels like there's not enough people, not enough support to get these things done. And I think thinking about tree supply is certainly true as well. So here's a couple quotes, really great quotes about increasing communication. A successful tree supply relationship involves everybody coming to the table and discussing this and not bullying each other around. So I did hear a lot of frustration between the sectors, a lot of sort of misunderstanding, just not getting why another group wants what they want. And so really building those partnerships is the way around that, I think, right? We have a successful tree supply because I really believe in relationships. Relationships help you smooth all these little bumps out. And I think that kind of gets back to my point about staffing. Like, it can be difficult to develop those relationships with the nurseries, with the producers, like if you don't have the staff time to do it. I was lucky to start my career out in New York City at the New York City Parks Department at the beginning of the Million Trees campaign. And so it was kind of amazing to just watch that unfold, and I realized that most places are not New York and they cannot throw as many resources at an issue, but it's just, they were constantly sending foresters out to the tree farms and to visit for them to learn, but also to communicate back, right, about what the city was looking for. And so finally, I just want to briefly touch on a U.S. Forest Service initiative called RINGER. I don't know if any folks here, has anyone here heard of RINGER before? All right, great. I love to see that. So just briefly, RINGER stands for Reforestation, Nurseries, and Genetic Resources. And so RINGER to the rescue. It's this really unique team that works across the United States. It's a national team, and it works across mission areas. So, we're often like really divided and siloed, but this team has been working across the nation developing technical resources that support, tree supply. And it includes scientists, communications, and they're developing resources to improve plant material for reforestation restoration projects, but also for, or I shouldn't say also, but including in urban areas. And excitingly, we have a new urban nursery specialist, Jahan, who has just started working a few months ago. at Ringer. And so this is a new position that is going to strengthen the partnership or, facilitate communication between urban and community forestry and Ringer expertise and resources. And so we're lucky that she's physically based in Philadelphia, even though it is a national team, but she's in our region. And so she's going to be out there meeting folks, networking, and developing resources, providing training on this topic. And so, I encourage you to look up Ringer and look at the resources they have, but in the next couple years to come, we should have, hopefully, a real explosion and improvement in urban-specific materials. So one of the first things that's happening within Ringer is the Forest Service, Urban and Community Forestry, has funded like an entire assessment, I'd say, of the urban component of Ringer. So looking at their online materials and database and trying to also, again, reach out to folks to understand what would be most beneficial nationwide, what they can provide as a resource. And so I'm part of the team we're doing that. So is Deb Hilbert, and it's being led by the Morton Arboretum. And so stay tuned for more on Ringer, but hopefully we'll be able to facilitate more of this dialogue and exchange to really improve our robust urban tree supply into the future. So with that, just thank you guys so much, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a great presentation. We appreciate it. And we have about 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions.
Mayor Coulter.
You what? Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Nancy, that was great. So I just want to retouch upon, I think, 2 really good points, is that gamble and then the contract growing. And I wanted to hear if there was any more anecdotes you might have. So, the municipalities know better than the grower, like the right tree, right place.
Yeah.
Are they going to be under wires? Where is it? And they know the diversity of their urban forest. And then I think lastly, it would lower their procurement costs, because they sort of like know what they have and they can sell that, rather than, I know that's a big piece of really any urban forestry operation.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, if you do 5,000 trees annually, if maybe municipalities would think, hey, we'll do 25% in a contract grow. And then I think more specifically, you probably don't need to contract out willow oaks and honey locusts and, things like that,
Yeah.
and maples, but maybe adding diversity to your underwire species,
Yes.
things like that. So I wonder if there's any further anecdotes, and then maybe I could chat with anyone else here who does their procurement.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It doesn't have to be everything. It should just be the species where you really where it's difficult to find them and you have to specifically source them. I think from the growers, it just seemed like, they'd say, well, yeah, I did that once like 10 years ago, but I don't really do it. Like, it's more trouble than it's worth. It's not reliable. And so it just makes me think, they are willing to go out on a limb. They're willing to do something that's not necessarily the easiest, I think, if the relationship is there. So it gets back to that. It's like they're not just going to go for something uncertain that they feel is risky right off the bat, but then eventually they will, come around, I think, and be willing to do it. So, yeah, I think this is a great, I'd love to hear if anyone else wants to talk about contract growing. I think it's always like a hot topic, and you hear talks from, presentations from people who have done it successfully, and it sounds great, but then hearing that other side of like, our grant period's not long enough, our funding's not secure enough to get it done. We have a question over here.
Hey, Nancy, thank you. Did you see any nurseries that had either a campaign or tags that indicated that species were climate resilient?
That's a good question. So unfortunately, these interviews were virtual, and we weren't at the nursery, because I would have loved to kind of walk around and look at that. But we did specifically ask, we kind of said, do you think about pest resilience? Do you think about climate resilience? Like, it was in there, and no one really jumped at it. No one was like, oh, absolutely. Like, climate resilience is important, and we highlight that or we market that. So I would say not that I'm aware of. Even though it's something that the urban foresters mention a lot. So that's definitely like a disconnect, I'd say.
Go ahead.
Yes, hello. I'm a landscape architect. My name's Tom Conley. I work for State Highways, and Nancy, I really appreciate you talking about diversity because that's pretty much I really work on that. And just for example, there's a project that I'm working on right now. It's a slope repair along 195 going up to BWI Airport, and of course I do have a plant list from MAA to have MAA approved plants to use on that, but along that slope, and everyone might not agree with me, but there's loblolly pines through that slope, and I just felt that because of diversity, I put in some evergreens, but then I also put some hardwoods in there too, to give it a little bit more diversity of that, loblolly pines. So I appreciate your talking about that.
That's great. I mean, it's great to hear. I think it's great to hear from the landscape architect community, like when you're thinking about it, and the more I'd say that you talk to your peers about it, it will be a benefit, certainly, for all of us.
Just 1 second. We got one over here.
I really appreciate you presenting this. And I do have one question about, as you were saying, what's native and
Yes.
native this and that. One of the issues that comes up is that once one group has a grant to produce a list of native to this region, but then the job is done. And as we discover species that, got left off the list still persists. And it becomes dogma then, not on purpose, with the best of intentions. You don't want to be the person to say, hey, you painted the room, but you missed a spot. Mm-hmm. But the issue is there isn't any way, how could we improve that so that people know, for example, not a tree, but that we do have native bamboo in this area, so you don't have to plant an Asiatic species. But it isn't out there, It's not in Home Depot with a label on it that says full sun.
Yeah,
So-
yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's something I've struggled with because I know the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, has its own list. The state of Maryland, the city of Baltimore, we can't all agree. So then just think about the nursery's perspective, right? They're like, you can't even agree. So. And you're coming to us, forget it. I'm just going to keep doing, October Glory and just not think about it. But no, you raise a really, really important point. And I guess I think that maybe, extension, I think, plays a really great role there. They often kind of bring us together, bring the state experts and federal and local to kind of come to consensus, but I don't know if it's realistic that there's ever going to be one definitive list. I would just say that it doesn't help us if we don't have our ducks in a row. It doesn't help us work with the private sector to get them to listen to our goals and requirements.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for your presentation. I have 2 points or 2 questions that I'd like you to respond to. One is the first part of your presentation. You were discussing the research on the human impacts on genetic diversity. And one area that was left out, I think, I'd like your opinion on, is the urban parks, state and local parks, stream valley parks and so on. These are preserved to the point where they are in danger. They're actually need to be managed more aggressively to maintain diversity and keep invasive species out. And the love of trees and the love of parks makes it very difficult for park managers to cut trees. And I wonder what this effect broadly is having on genetic diversity, and maybe that could be factored into part of the solution. And secondly, this conference, nothing has really been said about the using tree resources in a circular economy. Baltimore has a urban wood project. U.S. Forest Service has a workshop for tree care companies to identify trees that can be harvested in the urban environment and put into the supply chain. And Victoria, British Columbia, and many places around the world have fruit tree programs that identify and harvest fruit and share it with communities. There was a project in Greece to restore the landscape and the economy with the use of acorns in turning it into food, into acorn meal. We have walnuts here. So these programs might encourage a closer relationship with the communities to trees and appreciate tree diversity, and also provide an economy and a workforce to enter into the field. Thanks.
Thank you for both of those comments. I absolutely agree on both fronts. And in fact, those are two major topics that our office works on and studies and supports in Baltimore and elsewhere. I think that it's true that a lot of our natural areas, I was actually joking to some colleagues because I do a lot of work around those urban forest patches and natural areas, and I felt bad that today I wasn't explicitly talking about that as much. But it's true that we do need to manage them. We can't just leave them alone, right? And I think that that conversation is starting to change, and there's a lot more movement towards doing that. You know, cities just have typically started with like an arborist, right? And like that's the whole urban forestry program. And so they're really focused on liability and street trees. But as programs develop and that's under control, there's a look to these natural areas that of course are, you know, being overrun with invasive plants, vines, pulling trees down. And now we have, you know, beech leaf disease coming through, right? And we have so many beech trees in our natural areas in this region. So there's definitely a thought about how to actively manage, how to take trees down when necessary, even though that can be a difficult conversation, as you said, with urban tree canopy goals. But then what to replace them with and how to do that in a way that does increase our genetic diversity, species diversity, and resilience, I think is really important. And then on the point about the circular economy, yes, absolutely. I think you know, my colleague Morgan Grove, who some of you may know, definitely has this vision that we could employ folks to grow the trees in the nursery, in a municipal nursery, manage the trees, take the trees down, put them to use, you know, for urban wood products, and that we kind of are missing out on opportunities at both ends of that cycle. Washington, D.C. also does great work with urban wood reuse. So again, I think you've kind of hit on two topics that maybe are not like top of mind or the first thing that gets developed in an urban forestry program, but as it matures, they become incredibly important and are ways to connect with community and make people see kind of all the different values and aspects of trees throughout the city and throughout neighborhoods.
All right, thank you so much, Nancy. Let's give one more round of applause for Nancy.